The title of my talk today is, what would Dr. Ambedkar have made of India, of the Republic of India, in this year 2025, which is where we marked the 75th anniversary of the adoption of the Constitution, a document in whose drafting and passing Dr. Ambedkar played such a critical role. My lecture will look at the enduring relevance of Dr. Ambedkar's social and political ideas, and how some of his insights and concerns speak directly to where we find ourselves as citizens of the Indian Republic today. But I'm going to begin on a personal note, just with some brief remarks on my individual discovery of Dr. Ambedkar. I was born in 1958, a decade after independence, in the small, what was then the small sub-Himalayan town of Dehradun, in a family of public servants, devoted, as they saw it, to the well-being of the Republic. There were scientists, teachers, social workers, doctors, but at the same time, unconsciously or consciously of a certain caste and class background, born into an upper caste, middle class family. And my family of public servants, my parents and others, took as their moral beacons Gandhi and Nehru. Possibly, actually, Nehru a little more than Gandhi in the case of my own parents. And, there was always a portrait of Nehru at home, which is red rose. And I, like many children, adopted these values and, of my parents. And I grew up admiring Gandhi and Nehru, and I'll come back to that. I don't disavow that. I still, as a caveat and a disclaimer, I still admire Gandhi and Nehru. But Ambedkar was not part of my upbringing. It was not part of my upbringing at home. I mean, I don't want to dwell too much on my personal upbringing, except to say it was absolutely, completely secular. So there was, at home, no, people were treated as equal, regardless of religion or caste or gender, but unconsciously, of course, there was the heritage of thousands of years of Brahmin privilege. So there was Gandhi and Nehru and little Ambedkar. And that continued through my journey as a college student in Delhi and on to my PhD in Calcutta, which was not influenced by Gandhi and Ambedkar because it was in the realm of environmental history. And not influenced by Gandhi and Nehru, I beg your pardon, because it was on environmental history. Ambedkar was more or less, I kind of knew that he was involved in the drafting of the Constitution, but his extraordinary significance in our history, in our intellectual, political, and moral life was awakened by a seminar I attended in Manipal in the year 1994. Now, 1994 marked the 125th anniversary of Gandhi's birth. And the great Kannada novelist and public intellectual U.R. Ananthamurthy, who then was based in Manipal for a few years, organized a conference on Gandhi's legacy. It was held in the university and on a stage like this, and against a portrait of Gandhi in his loincloth, bare-chested and a staff. You all know that portrait. And there were many distinguished scholars. As I recall, there was Ashish Nandi, Jeet Oberoi, Claude Alvarez, the environmental activist from Goa, whose work some of you might know, and others. And for 2.5 days, we talked about Gandhi and his legacy, and, essentially, the conversation was, what would Mahatma Gandhi have made of the Republic of India today? That's really what it was, 1994. And of course, it was interesting, illuminating, enriching. On the last day, Ananthamurthy, there may be people here in this audience who remembered Ananthamurthy, and there was always an interesting twist in how he planned such things. On the last day, there was one talk in Kannada by a person who was not known to me at that stage and was known to some of the local residents of Manipal and Dakshin Kannada, but not known to the participants from northern and western and eastern India. This was the Kannada writer Devanur Mahadeva. And he gave a talk in Kannada, which was translated by Ananthamurthy. And I'm recalling it from 32 years ago. It's still visibly imprinted in my memory. So here was Mahadeva. Mahadeva, writes a very direct and sharp prose, but he has a very gentle, understated style of speaking. So he started speaking the translation, and he said, and as I said, this is from memory, I'm relying on Anantamurthy's translation. As I did then, he said, look, we have been here for 3 days, and we've been talking against this portrait of Bapu. And he addressed Gandhi respectfully as Bapu, Gandhiji. Now, let me read out to you a poem written by a Dalit woman. And this poem, he read out the poem and he said, this poem is exalting, celebrating a portrait of Dr. Ambedkar in a suit. Now, what is the meaning of that poem? Now, supposing Ambedkar was like Gandhiji, when you see Gandhiji in this loincloth, what do you say? What tyaga, what sacrifice? An upper caste baniya, son of a diwan, prosperous legal practice, gives it up to work with the people. Now what if Ambedkar is shown in that same loincloth and bare-chested? You will say, and allow me to give a Hindi translation because that's the Indian language I know best, आखिर वो तो हरिजन है और क्या पहनेगा? What else will he wear? It's his wearing a suit that is so remarkable, so distinctive, so counterintuitive, so against the grain of what history, culture, tradition, society permits to him. That is why this Dalit woman wrote a poem glorifying, celebrating Dr. Ambedkar in a suit. Now those 10 minutes of Mahadeva opened my mind. And I came back to Bangalore, I just recently moved to Bangalore, and started reading about Ambedkar. And it was a wake-up call. And now, if you just, before I come to what I started reading then, after that conference, just reflect on what Mahadeva said. It's not just a contrast between Gandhi and Ambedkar. It's between Ambedkar and every other icon of the freedom struggle. Gandhi, Nehru, Tagore, Subhash Chandra Bose, V.D. Savarkar, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Gopal Krishna Gokhale were all destined from birth and social privilege to be educated abroad, to travel abroad and wear a suit, and they may or may not have discarded it. So that is really a very important aspect of Ambedkar's journey, which Mahadeva brought to all of us, and I'm sure many others were as struck as me by his remarks. So after that conference, I started reading about and around Ambedkar, and 2 books in particular that I read 30 years ago made a profound impression on me. The first was Ambedkar's Annihilation of Cast. The edition I read, it had been published in 1990. It had a short introduction by the novelist Mulk Raj Anand. Now again, this is quite interesting to the historian of Indian nationalism and Indian social reform. Mulk Raj Anand, back in 1935, wrote a remarkable novel called Untouchable. It's the first social realist novel in English by an Indian describing the horrors of the caste system. He admired Gandhi for Gandhi's own campaign to end untouchability, yet he ended the novel Untouchable by suggesting Gandhi's methods could not provide a long-term solution, and it was really modernization and scientific progress and the flush toilet that would end the horrors of manual scavenging. Now, he came to Ambedkar much later. It's through his experiences. Mulk Raj Anand grew up in a small cantonment town in the Punjab where he observed untouchable behavior. He was from a middle caste himself. So in 1990, he discovers Ambedkar much later. In 1990, he writes an introduction to Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste. And then I read Annihilation of Caste. And some of you would have read it. I returned to it over and over again. I've recently wrote an introduction to a wonderful new edition of Annihilation of Caste with a very long gloss on it, which is even longer than Ambedkar's tract, by the Hyderabad philosopher Sayyid Saeed, which is a profoundly insightful book. And it's a direct act. It's a work of scholarship written for citizens. It's a model for every scholar today who wants to write for citizens, not just for your fellow scholars and for whatever it's called, citation index, Google Scholar, or whatever it's called. You know, it's written, it draws on deep learning. Of course, on personal experience, but even more on deep learning. But it's written with a directness and clarity that is truly admirable. And it shows him to be a brilliant thinker and a powerful polemicist, both. Now, again, with your permission, and with my apologies to those of you who knows this text well, some quotes from the Annihilation of Caste. I'm just going to give you two for the moment. Here's the first. You must, I quote, by the way, again, many of you know the background of the Annihilation of Caste. He was invited by a social reform group in the Punjab to give a lecture, and then when he sent the text, they withdrew the invitation, and then he printed it at his own expense. So he's telling these social reformers in the Punjab, kind of slightly left of the Arya Samaj, if I may say, those social reformers. He's telling them, you Hindu social reformers, trying to reform Hinduism, you must have the courage to tell the Hindus that what is wrong with them is their religion. The religion which has produced in them this notion of the sacredness of caste. The enemy you must grapple with, he's telling the reformers, is not the people who observe caste, but the Shastras which teach this religion of caste. That's my first quote. My second quote from this text, I quote, political tyranny is nothing compared to social tyranny. Political tyranny is nothing compared to social tyranny, and a reformer who defies society is much more courageous than a politician who defies government. Now, this is, I think it's fair to say, an implicit reference to Gandhi, who is leading the movement for freedom against British rule. He's defying society too, but he's more frontally defying the state and politicians. And Ambedkar is suggesting it's harder to challenge society than to challenge the state. Now, I have gone back to Annihilation several times. So that's one book that I read then that has stayed with me. The other book is somewhat different and has a different, but in my view, possibly complementary message to the Annihilation of Caste. It was written 57 years after Annihilation of Caste. This is the late, great D.R. Nagaraj's book, The Flaming Feet, which was first published in 1993 in a small, limited edition by a Bangalore NGO, and later republished with a very detailed, rigorous critical introduction by his student, my esteemed colleague at Kriya University, Dr. Prithvi Datta Chandra Shobi. And it's available, published by Permanent Black, in paperback. And for anyone interested in this subject, it should be mandatory reading. So I read The Flaming Feet in this small, privately printed edition. And it has a brilliant chapter on the Gandhi-Ambedkar relationship and debate, capturing the different parts taken by the two reformers when it comes to the question of the abolition of untouchability. And Ambedkar captures these two parts as Nagaraj characterizes these two parts as self-purification versus self-respect. Self-purification is Gandhi. Hinduism must cleanse itself of the sin of untouchability. Ambedkar is self-respect. Dalits must stand and affirm their rights in the famous slogan that he made popular, educate, agitate, organize. The self-purification of Gandhi sought to make upper caste abandon their arrogance and contempt for those whom the mere accident of birth had consigned to the bottom of the social hierarchy. On the other hand, the self-respect of Ambedkar was aimed at his fellow Dalits, urging them to claim rights of full and equal citizenship in the equal republic. Or as one might say, one can reconfigure Nagaraj's distinction between self-purification and self-respect as essentially saying Gandhi urged the Savarnas to rid themselves of their superiority complex, whereas Ambedkar urged the Dalits to rid themselves of their inferiority complex. Now, Nagaraj was writing in the 1990s, shortly after the observance of the birth centenary of Dr. Ambedkar, when there was a real surge in Dalit self-respect, consciousness, organization. The Bahujan Samaj Party was about to be formed, and the whole narrative was posing Ambedkar versus Gandhi. And Nagaraj argued, contrary to what was then the emerging narrative, that there is, I quote, a compelling need to achieve a synthesis of the legacies of Ambedkar and Gandhi. In other words, to build a more caring society, one needed both to awaken afresh the upper caste conscience and to consolidate the efforts for Dalit self-respect. Hence, insisted Nagaraj, I quote, Gandhiji and Ambedkar can and should be made complementary to one another. Now, what Mahadeva and Nagaraj alerted me to was the extraordinary significance of Ambedkar's work on behalf of the oppressed. He was the emancipator of the oppressed. But of course, he was also a profound scholar of democracy. And it's to that aspect of his work, a scholar, a student of constitutional democracy, I'm going to turn to that aspect of his work. And I'm going to offer you some quotes from his writings. Some are well known to specialists, but bear revisiting in the light of where we are today. Some are less well known to even to specialists, and I think are as timely and as relevant. So as I said, we are now in the year of the 75th anniversary of the promulgation of the Constitution. And you will recall in the last week of January 2025, running into what happened later, every politician of every party, of every generation, of every part of India was falling over themselves to claim Ambedkar and pay obeisance to Ambedkar. Though, of course, one wondered how many of them had read what Ambedkar said about constitutional democracy, and even if they had, how much they had digested. So I'm going to draw your attention in the first part of what I'm going to say about Ambedkar as a theorist of democracy to two remarkable speeches he made in the Constituent Assembly, which are there in the debates. And I said they're known to specialists, and certainly to general readers well-versed with our constitutional history, but I think they bear revisiting. The first speech was made on 4th November 1948, while Dr. Ambedkar was presenting the draft constitution to the Assembly. Here, Ambedkar stressed the importance of what he called constitutional morality. I quote, this is Ambedkar in his speech of November 1948, I quote, constitutional morality is not a natural sentiment. It has to be cultivated. We must realize that our people have yet to learn it. Democracy in India is only a top dressing on an Indian soil, which is essentially undemocratic. Ambedkar goes on to say, I quote, it is perfectly possible to pervert the Constitution without changing its form. I repeat, it is perfectly possible to pervert the Constitution without changing its form by merely changing the form of the administration and to make the administration inconsistent and opposed to the spirit of the Constitution. Now, this is Ambedkar in 1948. A quarter of a century later, in the early 1970s, the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi did precisely that. She sought to pervert the form of the bureaucracy and the judiciary by talking of a committed bureaucracy and a committed judiciary. And arguably, these ideas have been taken further by the government now in power, which has sought to rid the civil services, the police, the investigative agencies, the regulatory bodies, the judiciary, and even, as I speak, perhaps the Election Commission of the Independents, and make them subject to its political agenda. So it's perfectly possible to pervert the Constitution by perverting the administration in a way in which, and the judiciary and the investigative agencies, and maybe even the armed forces, in ways that make them act against the spirit of the Constitution. The second speech of Ambedkar's to the Constituent Assembly, I am going to draw your attention to, is a better known speech. It was made on 25th November 1949, when he presented the final document to the Assembly. And here he issued two warnings. This may be the one part of my lecture which possibly even a majority of this audience is familiar with the quotes. So I beg your indulgence in repeating quotes that may seem familiar, warnings and sentences of Ambedkar that may seem familiar, because I think they bear revisiting, reflecting upon afresh, given where we are today. The first one is about personality cult, so I'll just read you an abbreviated version. Bhakti, or what may be called the path of devotion or hero worship, plays a part in India's politics unequaled in magnitude by the part it plays in the politics of any other country in the world. And then Ambedkar adds, Bhakti in religion may be a route to the salvation of the soul. Bhakti or hero worship in politics is a sure road to degradation and to eventual dictatorship. Now this is 1949, and we have just observed the 50th anniversary of the Indian independence, where of course, where we saw this colossal personality cult. And allow me to say that the personality cult we are now living through is equally large, possibly even larger, because modern means of technology have allowed this cult to be magnified even further. So that's, and I'll return to this personality cult warning of Ambedkar's a little later. I mean, this is the one part I think most of you will be familiar with. The second warning, which is also there in that last speech, is really in some ways even more significant, because it goes to the heart of, Ambedkar's thinking. How it goes to the heart of where Ambedkar, the champion of the oppressed, merges with Ambedkar, the theorist of constitutional democracy and the chief draftsman of the Constitution. So this quote I'm going to read out to you is kind of bridges Ambedkar the citizen and Ambedkar the scholar, Ambedkar the activist and Ambedkar the constitutionalist, Ambedkar the professor. Again, it's well known, but at least to specialists, but still, I'm going to offer to you again. So here is Ambedkar saying, while presenting the final approved document of the Constitution to the Assembly in November 1949, he's saying, I quote, on the 26th of January 1950, which is when we will, that is where the country is going to adopt the Constitution. The 26th of January, incidentally, was chosen because it was the 26th of January 1930 that the first Independence Day was observed by the freedom struggle, what was then called the Independence Day. So Ambedkar says, on the 26th of January 1950, we are going to enter into a life of contradictions. In politics, we will have equality, and in social and economic life, we will have inequality. In politics, we will have equality, and in social and economic life, we will have inequality. In politics, we will be recognizing the principle of one man, one vote, or as we would now say, one person, one vote. In politics, we will be recognizing the principle of, if I can amend Ambedkar in the light of what is approved terminology today, in politics, we will be recognizing the principle of one person, one vote, and one vote, one value. In our social and economic life, we shall, by reason of our social and economic structure, continue to deny the principle of one person, one value. How long shall we continue to live this life of contradictions? How long shall we continue to deny equality in our social and economic life? Now, if you consider this very significant and indeed vital distinction that Ambedkar makes between equality in politics and inequality in social and economic life, 75 years later, that disjunction still persists. I mean, Of course, Ambedkar may not have recognized, I'm speaking on, what is it today, the 13th of July, 2025. Ambedkar may not have recognized that there could come a time that we may need not even have one person, one vote. Right, but let's assume we do, and all the noise about, the electoral rolls revision in Bihar is just noise. Let's assume that we do. Let's suspend our critical judgment for a minute. But there still is, where is one person, one value? Okay, now, when Ambedkar made this distinction, very important distinction between equality in politics and inequality in social and economic and cultural and institutional life, he largely had the rights of Dalits and women in mind. The Constitution had abolished caste and gender distinctions, but Ambedkar worried that in everyday life, discrimination against Dalits and women would persist. Hence, this warning that he issued to his fellow members of the Constituent Assembly. However, 75 years later, where we are today, apart from Dalits and women, there are two other social groups who in the India of 2025 are discriminated against, who don't have the same value, even if they may sometimes have the same vote, as other sections of society. And these two other disadvantaged groups, apart from Dalits and women, are Adivasis and Muslims. They, like Dalits and women, have the vote, but yet they are not often treated as equal citizens. The dispossession and discrimination that Adivasis have experienced since 1950 are arguably even greater than that of the Dalits, though for multiple reasons it has not got the same attention. And the harassment, stigmatization, and outright persecution of Indian Muslims is more intense now than at any time since January 1950. The democratic principle of one person, one value is especially denied to them. So what I've tried to suggest so far in my talk is that Dr. Ambedkar is justly celebrated as a great social reformer, as an emancipator of the oppressed. At the same time, I've argued, he was also a deeply original thinker about democracy and constitutionalism, as these examples I've quoted from his speeches in the Constituent Assembly, I think, demonstrate. Now, I'm going to offer some other select Ambedkar quotes made outside the Constituent Assembly, before and after. The Constituent Assembly, again, I'm really happy that now the Constituent Assembly debates are all available online. When I was writing my book, India After Gandhi, the original edition was out of print. And believe it or not, I read it in Stanford University. I'd gone there for 3 months and I read it, and now I have them all. They've been reprinted by the Lok Sabha Secretariat about maybe 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. And I'm glad they're all there online. I think when Sudhir was at APU also, he played some role in having them all put online. And to those of you who are not law students, please read them. They're incredibly illuminating. As an aside, I write my own books, but I take great pleasure in editing the works of others. And some of the books that have technically appeared under my name, are actually edited by me, and the anthologies I've done, including of political theorists, environmentalists, cricket writers, and so on. And I'm now probably too old, but one of my unfulfilled ambitions, which some younger scholars should do, is to do a really interesting curated edition, anthology of the interventions in the Constituent Assembly, by theme, including some of the themes that are so dear to Justice Ahmadi: federalism, social justice, equality, language, gender, freedom of speech. I think it will make a fascinating exercise, and of course, the whole diversity of views, including the completely crazy views, including those, I forget who it was, I think it was a politician from this state, by the way, who said, who complained about the Constitution, that we have got only a Western orchestra, where is the sitar and the veena? Now, it's not, by the way, criticism I sympathize with. I should make that clear. But at least when it comes to constitutional values, you don't know what ancient Indian society would have given us. Okay. Indian music is different. I love Indian music. But anyway, so I've just quoted some what Ambedkar's speech in the Constituent Assembly, I'm now going to give you, in the next part of my talk, in the penultimate part of my talk, some other select Ambedkar remarks made before and after.